Hi, Sean Munger here. Welcome back to my Historical Thoughts series. I'm making this video about the movie The Right Stuff, specifically for my nephew who is interested in seeing this movie. He's never seen it before. And I thought that I would do a little historical introduction to kind of lay the context for this movie that might give him a little bit more understanding of how the story develops and what it's really about. But I thought I would put it on my YouTube channel as well. I did something similar last summer with about Watergate involving the movie All the President's Men. So this one is about The Right Stuff, which is really one of the great movies of the 80s, one of the great movies of all time. Of course, it's about the early American space program, and I actually remember seeing this movie in theater when it came out in the fall of 1983. I was just 11, and I'm kind of lucky that I got to see it because actually this film was a bomb at the box office. Of course, it got a lot of critical acclaim and is now considered a classic, but it was not very successful when it first came out. But I do remember it being a really great movie. My dad was very interested in this subject. He was a career Air Force officer. So, of course, this all happened kind of in his milieu and was really interested in the history. So I incidentally did a guest appearance on a podcast recently in 2019, History by Hollywood, which is a really great podcast about interrogating the historical facts behind movies. And there's an episode about The Right Stuff. I'll put a link to that episode in the show or in the description down below. So be sure to catch that. It's really great. It was a lot of fun to do. So I highly recommend that. So The Right Stuff is, of course, about the space program, or more accurately, the transition into the space program. The historical background of The Right Stuff really starts with World War II. So Germany, of course, was at war with Great Britain beginning in 1939. But then in 1941, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. And then later that year, December 1941, Japan, Hitler's ally, attacked the United States. So this was how the United States became allied with the Soviet Union, because they were fighting our enemies. Even though the United States and Soviet Union really didn't like each other very much and had not gotten along very well before. But they were allies in World War II, so that's how that happened. During the war, Hitler developed what he called wonder weapons, which he thought was going to win the war for him. These were, for example, jet aircraft, the very first jet fighters. One of them was called the Me-262, a very famous plane. And then the Germans were also developing missiles, and particularly what they call the V1 and then the V2, which was really a ballistic missile. And what they used these weapons for was to bomb London. So there was a big rocket base on the coast of Germany, and they would launch these V2 rockets, which were full of explosives, and they would fly across the channel and then impact in London. So that's what they were about. And Germany was way ahead of anyone else in the world in developing this kind of technology. So the head of the V2 program was a guy named Wernher von Braun. He is actually a character in the movie The Right Stuff. And he claimed not to be a Nazi. I mean, of course, he was a member of the Nazi Party, but everybody was. But he claimed, I didn't really go along with the program, etc. But there is some evidence that he was, in fact, a dedicated Nazi, and that was controversial after the war. So the reason how Germans got involved with the American space program was because of something called Operation Paperclip. This was actually started even before the end of the war. It was originally called Operation Overcast. And the idea was that Americans were going to recruit from Germany scientists and engineers that had worked on these various programs for the German military, bring them to the U.S. and use them to gain a military advantage over the Soviet Union. There were many signs, even before the war was over, that there was going to be a break between the United States and Soviet Union after the war, that they were not going to remain allies much longer. And in fact, that is what happened. So this Operation Paperclip, over 1,600 scientists from Germany were recruited to come to the United States. The Soviet Union also got some German scientists. And in fact, there's a line in the movie where Werner von Braun says, "Our Germans are better than their Germans." That's what he's referring to as this Operation Paperclip thing. So the United States had developed the atom bomb during the war, Manhattan Project. And if you combine an atom bomb with a ballistic missile, like what Germany had, basically what you've got is a nuclear arms race. And that is, in fact, what got started. So everything done in aviation and space after World War II was part of this Cold War context. It was part of the competition between the United States and Soviet Union. U.S. and British engineers, and you can see at the beginning of the movie, The Right Stuff, it picks up with the breaking of the sound barrier. And U.S. and British engineers had started thinking about building a plane that could do this, that could break the sound barrier, before the war was over. In December 1944, they were working on this. And this was going to be an advanced prototype of a plane. It was going to be a rocket plane that combines missile technology with jet technology. So you got that kind of overlap between the two types of technology that were being developed. There was a huge, something else that's important, there was a huge expansion of aviation during World War II, especially by the United States. Originally, the planes were flown by the Army, and it was called, during World War II, the U.S. Army Air Corps. It was part of the Army. And the Army Air Corps flew strategic bombing missions over Europe and also in the Pacific. And this was thought, not without controversy, to be decisive. We're not sure that it was decisive, but it was thought by many people that it was. But clearly, we've got a great development of aviation technology during World War II. Toward the end of World War II, the United States developed its heaviest bomber to date, called the B-29. You'll see one in the movie. It's the bomber that drops Yeager's X-1 plane out of its belly like a bomb. And in fact, this plane was used for a number of devastating air raids on Japan in 1944 and 1945, and the two atom bombs were dropped out of B-29s. So the war ends, and then in 1947, under President Truman, the Army Air Corps was split off from the Army and turned into its own service, its own branch of the military, the United States Air Force. And that happened just at the same time as the Cold War between U.S. and Soviet Union really got going. So this step of really the human race into space was probably inevitable after the technological advances of World War II. And we're not just talking about just planes and rockets that were developed during the war, but also, for example, computers. ENIAC was the first real computer that was created, and that got going in 1946, right after the war. So you see this real explosion of technology after World War II, during and after World War II, that enables us to go into space. Now, always, and hopefully you will notice in the movie, that there's really a tension between peaceful exploration of space and military projects and military uses of space technology. Now, that tension was never resolved. And it was especially prominent in the height of the Cold War in the 1950s, 1960s, where everything was a contest between the United States and Soviet Union. So, of course, this is where we get who's going to be the first into space, who's going to be the first to orbit the Earth, who's going to be the first to land on the moon. We have to beat the Russians. Everything's a contest, and it's part of that Cold War tension. And you'll see in the later parts of the movie, all the space stuff that you see, the rockets and all that stuff, most of that is hardware that was originally developed for military purposes. For example, the rockets that the Mercury astronauts used to blast off are ballistic missiles that were originally developed to carry nuclear weapons. So this tension between peaceful exploration of space and military exploitation, that tension is always there. So the movie picks up in 1947 and goes through 1963. So we're really talking about 15, 16 years. And it's based on a classic book by Tom Wolfe called, of course, The Right Stuff. And this is sort of a nonfiction novel. It came out of the New York literary culture of the 1970s. All I need to do is show you Tom Wolfe's picture on the back of the book, and you can kind of definitely see this sort of New York literati culture this was his first major book. The movie The Right Stuff could only have been made in the 80s, particularly the early 80s. If it was made in the 70s, it would have been really cynical and dark because people were very distrustful coming out of Vietnam, very distrustful of the government and of America in general. And so the movie would have been too dark. If it was made later in the 90s, it would have been exactly the opposite direction. It would have been too jingoistic, too bombastic. It would have been a big action movie, and they would not have really gotten the history right, I think. So really only the 80s could have gotten this movie right. Though it's not made as such, you can kind of think of the movie Apollo 13 as a sequel to The Right Stuff. Apollo 13 came out in the mid-90s. And again, a movie perfectly positioned in time to tell the story the way it tells it. And Apollo 13 could not have been made in the 80s, could not have been made in the 2000s. It could only have come out in the 90s. So be wary of where the movie sits in time as well as the time that it portrays. So, hope you enjoy the film. A great movie, and I'll put the link to the podcast episode in the description of this video. So, please like, subscribe, and share, do all that good stuff, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.